Welcome. I'm going to get started because we only have until 3:30. So as more people may log on, I'll just admit them in as we go on. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining into this session. My name is Talin Jermagiam, and I'm with the Genocide Education Project, which is based out here in California. But we service and help educators across the United States. So we're here today to talk about human rights and teaching genocide within our classrooms. Teaching genocide within our classrooms is a really delicate and sensitive matter, and depending on the age range and maturity level, which us as educators, we are the best gauge in that within our classrooms, that determines how we can go about teaching this really complex concept to these young minds. So I'm going to get started with the presentation that I have. Just give me a second to share the screen. And if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box. And if we have time, we'll have time at the end for sure. We can go through them, or we can just have some time to chat with each other. So share the screen. Okay, so up top, actually in the middle, everyone can see the screen, yes? Okay, good, thank you. If you have a QR code, so if you have your cell phone next to you, you can go ahead and scan this QR code. And what this does is that it links you to a Google Drive folder. And that folder has a bunch of resources that I'm using in today's presentation. It also has some additional resources that we're giving. And also, if you bookmark www.genocideeducation.org, that's our website. And there are a ton of available free resources, lesson plans, primary source documents, videos that you can use to help facilitate your instruction in your classroom. It's a great tool to have, and there's a lot of material there. So, sorry, it has a mind of its own, hold on. So why do we teach about genocide? We teach about genocide as an act of remembrance. Every genocide has impacted our world in a way that, and generations in a way that deserves to be remembered and recognized as part of the healing process. It's a foundation for students to understand very modern and old concepts and of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. These are things that our students deal with, that we deal with on a daily basis. And we can see how, when they get taken to the extreme, the consequences that these concepts have on in our life, in our day-to-day life. As I said before, the complex nature of genocide involves historical, social, religious, political, and economic factors. There's a lot of motive behind somebody a group of people committing this human rights atrocity. And also it brings out that critical thinking component for our students, where they assess and think about, well, what can we do to prevent this? How can we make it so that these things don't occur in the future? And using the Armenian genocide as a case study, which the genocide project also delves into the Holocaust and all other genocides that have occurred within the 20th century and now the 21st century. But the reason why the Armenian genocide is used as a as a case study is because it was the first genocide in modern history. So it was the first one where you have letters, photographic evidence, written accounts of what happened, and you still have people, generational families that are affected by it. Personal, just to give a little background information on myself and how I am directly a product of genocide survival. So there's a photo here of me giving a smooch on the cheek to my husband's grandfather. When we got married, we flew to Beirut, Lebanon, so that I can meet them. Over here, he's about 101 and 102 years old. He didn't know his actual age because he didn't know the year that he was born. And Penyamin, his name was Penyamin, was born in Babek, Turkey, and his whole family was massacred during the genocide except for his 15-year-old aunt. And it was him and his 15-year-old aunt that made that were part of the deportations through the desert of Deir Zor, which led them from Turkey into Aleppo, Syria. When he arrived in Aleppo, Syria, there were like refugee camps at the time where they were collecting children and sending them to what was known as the Bird's Nest Orphanage in Lebanon. So he was taken to the Bird's Nest Orphanage. When he got there, they clean him up, they feed him, they try to see, do you know your name? Do you know where you come from? And he only knew that his name was Penyamin. He didn't know how old he was. They said, okay, here's your name, here's your new last name. We think you're about 5 years old, and they created the documentation for him from that point forward. His 15-year-old aunt at the time later went to Lebanon and stayed within a walking distance. Although she couldn't be in the orphanage herself, she got a job in a household and was able to keep an eye on her nephew during that time. His aunt suffered great tragedy along the way during the deportations, as you can imagine, all the human rights violations she experienced between torture and sexual assault. And he never talked about it. I've asked questions to my husband and to my mother-in-law. He's never talked about it. All he knows is that, he's happy. He was proud in his old age. He said, I'm proud that I survived and I was able to make an Armenian family out of the ruins. So, and that's what he did. He was able to, cultivate his family. And that's how I got my husband too, who is his grandson. As for this picture on the lower is a picture of my family. This man right here is my great-grandfather. He was born in Konya, Turkey. And when the massacres started, he was actually in college and university at Sorbonne in France. Miraculously, word got to the family that these massacres were happening in the surrounding villages, and and his family, most of them, were able to escape to Greece. And when he made it to Greece after France, he was told to go to Alexandria, Egypt, where he became a headmaster of an Armenian orphanage there. It's where he met his wife, my great-grandmother. They raised their 3 children in that orphanage. And this photo is his goodbye farewell photo. All these, except for these 3 little children laying in the front, which are my grandfather, his brother, and his sister, all of these were the original orphans that he went and helped raise and move on with their lives. After this photo was taken, he moved to Greece and became a principal of an Armenian school that had just opened up there. So in a historical context, both mine and my husband's and every single Armenian family that there is has been affected by genocide. In a modern sense, this is a photo of the Armenian church in San Francisco in September 2020, which was a product of arson. In September 2020, if some of you are familiar, there was a conflict in the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, also known as Artsakh, between the ethnic Armenian population and the Azeri army. Here in San Francisco, during that time, an Armenian church and its building went on fire. Inside on the walls, there was Azeri graffiti, which the police department, just by that alone, determined it was arson. Our Gen Ed office actually burned as well. It was devastating, and it's not, this is a way to show your students that the effects of genocide and animosity and cultural stereotyping can happen 107 years ago in 1915 to 2020 today. And it doesn't have to be in a region that we don't really know or we're not familiar with. This happened in the Western world, in California, September 2020. Are we teaching genocide education correctly? Genocide education has come a long way. And we have this photo here as an example, because what we want to focus on is genocide education is not just talking about genocide and what happened during the genocide and all the gory details that, that we were taught along the way. It's about getting the message across that genocide and human rights go hand in hand. Human rights is the first step. When you are going against human rights, usually that leads to the consequences of things like genocide. Here we have this photo of a boxcar, a Holocaust boxcar, and there's a hypocrisy to this photo because this is located in Whitwell, Tennessee. It's a boxcar that we know these were used to transport the Jewish population to the concentration camps, but it's a memorial in a town in Tennessee that has a really bad track record of anti-immigration laws, anti-basic rights, really lacking diversity. So it's kind of this, well, you're showing the consequences of people having their access to their basic human rights and not be with stereotyping, but it's in a town that does the exact same thing, minus, of course, the grotesque concept of genocide itself. There's a hypocrisy to it. Starting with human rights, as I said, there's this, I know it's British Columbia and it's focused on a Canadian video, but if you find this link, it's actually a really nice way to introduce what human rights actually are to your students. It's very simple, easy to follow along. And yes, it does talk a little bit about Canada toward the middle of the video. You can stop it after you get the first, I think, a minute and a half. And it does just like a good overview of what does human rights mean. So I like to show this video to my students because actually the British Columbian Constitution of Human Rights is actually very similar to the Californian. It might not be the same as Michigan, but the first minute and a half and the last 45 seconds of the video is really a very generic overview. Okay, so most of us are familiar with also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in that QR code that you had in the beginning of the presentation, you have a copy of that document. So what I like to do is start my lesson off this way. What we do is we watch this video that I'm about to show you. Let's watch it. It's a very short clip that you show to your students, and then you have them break out into groups and look over the Declaration of Human Rights, and you ask them, can you show me, based on that short video, what human rights violations were implied? And they'll look through it and they'll list their ideas, and then you'll go into a discussion about it. Then the following day, you dive into what the definition of genocide. The definition of genocide didn't exist. The term genocide didn't exist during the Armenian genocide time. It was something that was invented by Raphael Lemkin, who was a Polish Jew whose whole family was exterminated during the Holocaust. And he was, he coined the word genocide in 1941, yes, no, 1943, he coined the word genocide. And the main point of that, the key point of the term genocide is there has to be intent. There has to be an intent to destroy and eliminate a certain group of individuals. So Raphael Lemkin, you would discuss the definition of genocide, and then you would move on to talking about how that led to the Convention of the Prevention of Genocide and the Punishment. So this convention occurred when, sorry, I'm having technical difficulties. So this was when that intent to destroy definition was put: killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group. And it's important to note that genocide does not have to be mass killings. It can occur with or without. Genocide, the number of people that died does not make one genocide less than or one genocide more. The core of genocide is the intent to destroy a group of people, and the horrific events and no legal repercussions from that. So how do we show intent to our students using the Armenian case. We have some primary source documents. This is a government order from Talat Pasha. Talat Pasha was the interior minister of the Ottoman Empire during that time. And this order says, you would translate it and say, now that all obstacles are removed, it is urgently recommended that you should not be moved for feelings of pity on seeing their miserable plight, but by putting an end to them all. Try with all your might to obliterate the very name Armenia from Turkey. So you would give this primary source document with the translation and ask your students, how does this show intent? How do we know that this fits into the definition of genocide? And depending on the maturity level of your students, there are photographic evidence that you can show as well. We have April 24th. The timing of this conference comes at a real important time for this subject matter, as this Sunday is April 24th, where Armenians around the world will be commemorating the Armenian genocide and remembering. So there was this is a photo showing that it started with the gathering of all the intellectuals within these Armenian villages and massacring the intellectuals. You ask your students, why would they go take this step? How could it harm the people of these villages by first gathering the men and all the intellectuals and those with, how does that fit into the term of genocide? This is a photo showing the deportations, removal of people, the forced removal of people from their homes. This is a really graphic and intense photo. The consequences of these actions, starvation along the way, during the deportations, leaving these villages without food, protection. This map here shows where the greatest massacre sites occurred, but it also shows the movement of people. You can show this map to your students and not tell them anything. You can show them and have them look and be like, well, these areas were majority Armenian occupied. What happened? Why did they move? Where did they go? Where did a majority of these people go? And they ended up in a desert. What is the point of that? Obviously, there is one outcome of this movement. It's to rid this region of the Armenian population, which is a goal of genocide within itself. Then you can go ahead and show this video again, the same video that I showed before of that man, Australian little old man talking about he doesn't know his name, he doesn't know, he's somebody, but he's nobody. And then they can now tell you, how does his experience tell you that this was actually genocide? What he went through, not only did he experience the lack of basic human rights as a child, he also was a product of genocide. This is where they connect genocide and human rights together. So before I move on to the next part, which is the 10 stages of genocide, I want to give a moment and see, are there any questions or anything we want to touch base on before I move on to the 10 stages? You can unmute or you can, everyone good to go? Okay. Okay, so 10 stages of genocide. We move on to how genocide just doesn't occur overnight. It is a process that happens over a period of time. The genocide of the Armenian people, even though it's considered the bulk of it in 1915, actually started occurring for almost a decade or two before, with some of the Hamidian massacres and all of those events that led to it. Then came a regime change where Armenians were left without basic rights within property. They had to pay more taxes than a Turkish Ottoman Empire citizen. They weren't allowed to have weapons. It was a progression to what happened intensely in 1915. And the 10 stages of that genocide are broken up into like 3 sectors. The first sector, 1 through 3, then the middle, 4 through 5, and 7 through 10 is the actual bulk. It's the execution of the planning and also the aftermath. And I'm gonna go through each one briefly and also tell you how you can go through these stages and have a critical thinking assignment and component with your students at the end. So classification, us versus them, distinguished by nationality, ethnicity, race, or religion. Classifications is a primary method of dividing society and creating a power struggle. Us versus them, this happened in the Holocaust. The Jewish population versus the German population, they're taking our jobs. They're hurting our economy. We're hungry because of them. So it's this mentality that starts forming of they're the problem. And we need to take over. We need to make sure that they don't continue being the problem. And what a good idea is then to have your kids go ahead and say, all right, give me a couple ways of how this can be prevented. How can we prevent classification? So your students might come up with, oh, you promote common identities. Well, you know, you speak the same language, you go to the same schools, you were raised in the same neighborhoods, you find common ground. These are the types of things your students will have to come up with, where you can go ahead and show that in order to prevent it, you got to find the commonalities more than the differences. Stage 2 is symbolization. You start having symbols represent groups of people. Names, German versus Jew, Turk versus Armenian, Urdu versus Bengali, the type of clothing, patches, symbols, flags. We see this all around us, and we see this to this day with white power movements in the United States that use the Nazi symbol, the swastika. There is a symbolization of us versus them. And you would go on and be like, well, how do we remove symbolization in cultures and within other countries and in our own country? How do we remove this type of symbolization? Discrimination. Discrimination is a big one. Discrimination is something that unfortunately we still deal with to this day, that our students might be dealing with it, depending on who they're exposed to, what they're exposed to. How do we go about how do we prevent discrimination? You would ask them to critically think about how. So in Armenians, for the Armenian case that I said, we had to pay higher taxes, we had restricted legal rights, we had limits on property, second-class citizens. what do we do to make sure that there aren't any second-class citizens within a region? There has to be accountability. There has to be legal repercussions to those concepts. Discrimination, like this is just saying that discrimination still exists to this day. It's something that we've been fighting in the United States for a long time, between the Civil Rights Act and Women's Voting Amendment, Indian Citizenship Act. All of these things had to be put in place because of discriminatory practices that happened. Dehumanization. This is a big one. Now we're in that middle portion of the 10 stages, 4, 5, 6. Dehumanization. And what's interesting about dehumanization is that if you're using the Armenian case, this didn't occur actually with the Armenian case. There were never the Armenian population, although we were succumbed to intense mistreatment, we weren't dehumanized, meaning Turkish individuals were encouraged to go ahead and marry Armenian women and, you know, thin out the Armenian bloodline by bringing Turkish children with these Armenian women and making them forget about their background and their ancestry. Whereas you can look at the Rwandan genocide, there was an extreme level of dehumanization where the Tutsi were known as the cockroaches, dehumanizing them to an animal level. This is a good compare and contrast activity. You can put two genocide together and show how one may have fit in this category, but it didn't fit in the other. Dehumanization also involves not only comparing them to people, to animals, insects, and whatnot, but it also says, you know, labeling them as traitors, labeling them as people that are beneath you, lower than you. Tactics of dehumanization. How do we critical thinking component? How do we stop the tactics of dehumanization? Do we not give the platform in speeches, print, social media? Do we not use comparisons to animal or vermin for people? This is where our students would come up with these prevention strategies, which would be humanization. Stage 5, organization. This is when the planning starts. It's an organized crime. It has a plan for a final solution, and the final solution is extermination. It's to cleanse an area of a certain group of people by all means necessary. Polarization is when things start heating up in these communities, in these countries, where there's extreme division between the people that are the attackers and those that are being attacked. Laws are passed to forbid intermarriage and social interaction. The Jews during the Holocaust were moved into the ghettos. This is before they were then moved from the ghettos to the concentration camps. So there's, how do we how do we go ahead and protest these policies? At the time, it was considered to be unpatriotic to not be on the side of one or the other. These are mentalities that need to be, these are barriers that need to be broken. And then we have the final bulk of the genocide, 10 stages of genocide: preparation, planning, Here we have the house in Berlin where Nazi leaders planned the final solution to the Jewish question in 1942. What are we going to do? Well, we've dehumanized them, we've polarized them, there's animosity, they've been moved to the ghettos. Now what? Now what do we do? Well, this is when the concentration camp and the movement into those forced labor camps started. They start building up their stockpiles, military, secret ways of killing. This, in the Armenian case, this is when the deportations were being planned, the raids were going on in the villages, people, farmers and villagers, anything that could be used as a weapon was starting to be confiscated and taken away so that there's no self-defense. Persecution. This is when you start going after the group that you're targeting in genocide. You separate the victims, you take their property, you force victims out from their homes into the ghettos, into the desert, whatever it may be, whatever that plan is, you're starting to make that movement. Extermination. This is the most graphic and intense part of the genocide, is the killings, the mass killings, be it in the gas chambers, be it on the streets of the deportation, piling people into buildings and setting the buildings on fire. This is the bulk of the atrocities that occur in genocide. You can have there's some photographic, some documents showing the Nazis killing squad. Intervention. What do we, at this point, news is out there. At this point, it's known what's going on. What is going to happen? Even in 1915, where we didn't have the type of communication and technology that exists today, people knew what was going on. There was an active movement. At that time, there was a United States campaign, Feed the Starving Armenians, where, you know, mothers would tell their children, don't waste your food, they're starving Armenians. Or there were humanitarian missions and missionaries going and trying to help. A lot of these orphanages for Armenians were run by non-Armenians. They were run by non-Armenian missionaries and women and men who went and helped. Now we have the technology, the social media, the video evidence to really have a greater grasp on how we can intervene, and yet a lot of times we don't. That's something that our kids need to understand, is that we have the power to intervene now to an extent that we didn't have before, and yet we still, it takes us a while. We always have that resistance. Why? And this is another critical thinking component for our children to think about. And the last stage is denial. Denial comes in many forms. It could be lifelong. It could be very brief. During the Holocaust, the Germans, they denied, but they didn't deny. They denied, they were like, oh, no, that's all, you know, that's not really happening. But in the end, it was found out. These concentration camps were liberated by American soldiers, and there was no moving on from there. And what was happening is Germany was penalized at the end of World War II, not only for their human rights atrocities, but for being the other side of World War II. Whereas the Armenian genocide, to this day, still is going through denial. The Turkish government spends billions of dollars a year denying that this event ever happened. Why? There's lots of reasoning behind it. but denial can be during the actual commitment of the crimes, and it could be it could last for 107 years later as well. Why does denial promote further genocide? Well, we can look at the case between the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide, where Hitler is actually quoted in saying, "And who then remembers the Armenians?" Because no one was penalized. No, there were no repercussions. Those that committed the atrocities of the Armenian genocides exiled and fled. The US government didn't do anything at that time. World War I was finishing as well. We went into a period of isolationism mentality. There were no serious repercussions to the Turkish government or to the leaders of the Ottoman Empire who did this genocide. And what happened is less than 25, 30 years later, the same thing was happening in the Western world, in Europe, during another world war. And then it happened again throughout history. We have Rwanda, we have Cambodia, we have all these contexts that they continue and continue and continue because were the repercussions strong enough? Were the repercussions strong enough? And this is where our kids can go in and say, and you can give them what are the consequences of denial. So I'm going to stop here because our time is coming to a close. I wanted to thank you all for being here and also remind you that you have access to all this information, all these materials, both from that QR code at the beginning and also on the genocideeducation.org website. Use it. You can reach out to the Genocide Education Project if you need help or additional items. Can you put the link for the QR code in the chat? I can try, yes. One moment. Let me know if that worked.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Any questions before we have to sign off? We have about 4 minutes before I'm being told I need to log off. So any questions or anything?
It was interesting last year when I did Armenian genocide. I was a little behind in my curriculum because of COVID and stuff. So the date last year I was teaching it on April 24th, and it was just it was like the current event that happened with it with Biden finally recognizing the term genocide for what happened to with the Armenian massacres, actually using the term genocide as much as the Turks are very dead set against it and still are. So that's interesting. I still do something with that and talk about what the geopolitical ramifications are too.
Yeah, the day that was announced by Biden, Turkey recalled their ambassadors from the United States. Immediately, they recalled their ambassadors, and it was a big deal. It was a big deal. So yeah, to have it actually teaching it on April 24th as well. Roxanne is actually on right now. She is the head of the Genocide Education Project, and she's saying in the chat that if you want to be on our mailing list, you can put your contact info here, or you can go on the website and you'll have access to those materials. Roxanne, if you want to say hi.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I think the recording of this will also be still accessible to you and others who registered but weren't able to join later through MCSS. So that's great. And oh, thank you, Frank, for your contact information. If you're still on, tell me where you're from. Maybe he didn't hear that. Oh, there you go. But where is Lake Fenton? Somewhere in Michigan. I know Linden. Okay, got it.
Oh, it's sorry, Fenton, Linden. It's by
Got it.
by between Flint and Detroit.
Got it. Great.
Suburb in between there.
Great. Thank you very much. Hold on. I hope we're not going to get disconnected while I grab all the information. Okay, and Joy Bollinger. Thank you, Joy. Well, we appreciate all of you, including the Armenian genocide and genocide generally, particularly a comparative look is important for students to see that, you know, genocides didn't start and end with a particular case, but unfortunately, they've been with us throughout history. And the Armenian case is particular for a number of reasons. You know, being kind of the first one that employed industrial, you know, the tools of the industrial revolution, which made killing a lot easier and faster and a lot more wide scale, as well as you heard, Raphael Lemkin actually using the Armenian case to create the word, to invent the word, the connections directly with the Holocaust and Adolf Hitler's studying of the Armenian genocide to perfect it even more. So there are various ways that the Armenian case really fits well into a comparative look for students. And we encourage you to use that. And thank you again very much.